Yarrow swatted aside the blow with a light flick of the wrists and spun on his feet, moving just out of reach of the flurry of attacks that followed. "You've grown slow," he said as his opponent came at him again. She feinted to the right, dodging his thrust before changing stances and lashing out at his knee with her boot. She followed up with a lunging assault, throwing her weight fully behind the blows as she aimed to force his guard down. Yarrow suffered the onslaught with a grunt before pushing her back with a series of complex maneuvers. His strikes came thick and fast, and he could feel her strength waning beneath the blows. She made as if to disengage, pulling away from his attacks, but swooped forward at the last second, swinging her sword with both hands. Yarrow saw the move coming, and shifted his weight onto his back leg, leaning away from her. He lowered his sword as Alina's blade swept over his head, and stepped inside her guard. A look of annoyance flashed across her face as she felt the blunted tip of Yarrow's training sword press against her side.
"Again,"
she said, blowing a lock of brown hair out from her eyes. Yarrow smiled and nodded before lowering his sword and stepping back. He assumed the volante guard, his feet spread out at a 30-degree angle, his sword resting in his grip just above the midriff in the style of the Hathian blade masters. Alina mirrored his stance and arched a brow, inviting him to make the first move. The two continued their duel beneath the watchful eyes of Bellis and a small crowd of off-duty prospects who cheered the combatants on from the balcony above. Currency exchanged hands as the trainees bet on the outcome, squandering their meager earnings on the fight or else betting positions on the duty roster. The odds were in Yarrow's favor, they always were, but that didn't stop Bellis from making a sizable wager on his opponent.
"Come on, girl,"
he bellowed.
"Put the old man on his arse."
Yarrow ducked behind one of the training posts that littered the yard and waved up at the balcony.
"Come do it yourself,"
he called back with a laugh. Alina darted past the post, eager to take advantage of Yarrow's lapse in focus. Moving into a crouch, she slid beneath the arm of the training dummy and propelled herself toward the captain's undefended flank. But Yarrow was too quick. He parried the blow with ease before responding with a deluge of lightning-fast counterattacks. Alina soon found herself pushed up against the post by the barrage, where she had to use all of her skill to prevent the blows from hitting home. With her back against the wall and nowhere to go, she was about to concede until she saw the amused smile on Yarrow's face. With an angry snarl, she pushed back against his attacks, slamming her curved sword against his and lashing out with her hands and feet. The smile faded from Yarrow's face as he was forced to fend off her angry rejoinder, and he quickly found himself on the back foot for the first time in the fight. Alina's ferocity paid off when she caught the edge of his blade against her sword's hilt and twisted her handle downward in an attempt to lock their blades. Yarrow pulled away before she could complete the move, but by then it was too late. Alina dropped bodily to the floor and swept her leg out in front of her. She was rewarded by a painful grunt as her foreleg connected with Yarrow's ankles. With a groan from the balcony above, the captain crashed down to the floor beside her.
"You've grown slow."
She returned the slight, dragging her sword awkwardly across the ground to pin him. Yarrow winked, the amused smile back on his face, and tilted his head pointedly at her waist. Alina let out a dispirited sigh as she noticed the blade pressed, once again, against her side.
"Close,"
said Yarrow as he pulled her up from the ground.
"But you lowered your guard when you should have pressed, giving me too much time to recover."
Alina patted down her dusty breeches and shook her head.
"Always one step ahead, Captain."
"Not for long, I think,"
he said, looking at his sparring partner fondly. Alina was taller than him, but not by much. Her long dark hair was tied back in a bun behind her head. Her unruly curls could not be contained, though, and dangled loosely over her eyes.
"Nothing worse than losing coin to bloody cubs,"
said Bellis as he strolled over to them, a severe look on his weather-worn features. He clasped Alina by the shoulder as a grin broke out upon his face.
"But you did put him on his arse."
Yarrow rolled his eyes as his second's laughter echoed across the yard.
"It's more than you could do,"
he said, rolling the practice blade between his palms as he watched his lieutenant, eager to see if he'd rise to the bait. Bellis relinquished his grip on Alina and shrugged his brawny shoulders.
"No such thing as a training hammer,"
he said with a chuckle.
"Else I'd knock that puny sword from your hands and bounce you from wall to wall."
Yarrow laughed good-naturedly as the three of them walked back towards the armory, teasing each other as they went. The trio crossed under the arched doorway beneath the balcony, moving into the winding passages of the keep itself. To some, the Urson Keep was a monolithic blister upon the otherwise unblemished skin of Rayons. Archaic in its construction, its high walls, crenulated edges, and somber colors clashed with the smooth, flowing architecture of the villas and palaces that epitomized the district surrounding it. The wealthy families viewed it as a necessary intrusion into their world, an eyesore they gladly suffered in exchange for the security it afforded them. A fortress within a city, it represented the unquestionable strength of the throne, and in turn, the safety of their own positions. To others, namely the Hussars, the Ursen Keep was something more. It reminded them of their home of Kunsk, and of the duty owed by all principalities to their king, a duty the Hussars still felt strongly to this day. Prior to the unification, Greater Varin had been ravaged by war. Dozens of factions, led by self-proclaimed kings, had vied for supremacy, and hardly a year went by that wasn't marked by violence. Kunsk felt it harder than most, and the principality exchanged hands more times than Yarrow could have counted. Wars cost money, and the valuable mines that punctured the mountainous terrain made it a target for any would-be king. It was only when King Behan's grandsire and his brothers challenged for the throne that Kunsk found peace. United under the banners of King Cedric, an alliance rode out and finally won their freedom. It was in this final battle that the Black Hussars earned their place by the king's side. In the heat of combat, King Cedric had found himself separated from his bodyguard and fighting for his life. Beset on all sides by Ornasian cavalry, it had seemed his last moments were upon him when a troop of mounted hussars broke through the enemy lines. They fought with unparalleled fury, their mounts tearing through the heavy destriers while their riders hacked apart anyone willing to challenge them. They suffered heavy losses and were reduced almost to a man by the time Cedric's forces reached them. The king, honored by the hussars' willingness to sacrifice themselves for his safety, awarded them with what became known as the Ursen Keep and declared them as his own personal guard. They had served the throne with pride ever since, growing in size and renown as the years passed, with only a single blemish on their otherwise spotless record. That mistake had nearly cost King Behan his life, and though the fault lay not with Yarrow, being but a lieutenant at the time, he carried the burden as if it were his own. Yarrow shooed a pair of prospects out of his way as he strode into the armory, waving his training sword like a bludgeon as they scattered before him.
"I better not find the two of you on the duty roster,"
he called as they scampered off. Bellis watched them go as Alina and Yarrow packed away their training gear.
"You're too soft on them,"
he said, assisting Yarrow with the straps of his leather chest piece.
"Could you imagine old man Gelt letting us off with just a scolding?"
Yarrow smiled at the thought of his old training master.
"That didn't stop us though, did it? He lashed us black and blue if he caught us sneaking off into the city at night. And the next night we do it all over again,"
Bellis replied with a grin.
"I can still feel the welts."
Yarrow nodded and slotted his blade into the sword rack above the lockers.
"Perhaps it's for the best that he's retired,"
he said with a wink to Alina.
"I'm not sure our younger recruits would have survived his administrations."
Alina scoffed, slamming her locker shut as she turned to Bellis and the captain.
If you think Master Umber has a lighter hand,
She shook her head.
my own bruises beg to differ.
"I can still feel the beatings now,"
said Bellis as they made for the door at the opposite end of the armory.
"I swear Gelt trained more with the lash than the sword."
At least Gelt's retired. I still have to see Master Umber every day.
"Look at the pair of you,"
said Yarrow.
"Quivering in your boots like a pair of cubs."
Bellis pushed him none too gently by the shoulder, sending his captain stumbling ahead.
"You're right."
Yarrow came to a stop just before the door, still grinning.
"There's no longer any discipline in this regiment. It'll have to be the lash for you, young Bellis. We'll see if we can't dredge old Gelt back out of retirement. I'm sure he'd return in a heartbeat if it meant having another go at you." "He'd have a tough time of it if he tried."
Bellis rolled his broad shoulders and curled his fingers into a fist.
"I could crush that pipsqueak in the—"
A low, rumbling growl echoed through the passageway ahead, stopping Bellis in his tracks.
That sounds like Duke,
said Alina with a glance to Bellis. Another bestial noise washed over them.
He's missed you.
"And his supper by the sound of it,"
said Yarrow as they continued their approach. Light flooded into the passage as it opened up, covering a steep set of winding steps in its golden glow. Bellis bounded up ahead, taking the steps two at a time, Duke's deep grumbles hastening his ascent.
"There he is,"
said Bellis as the passageway came to an abrupt end, its walls parting before a colossal chamber that stretched as far as the eye could see. Concrete levels, the height and length of a man, rose up around them, encircling an open area of sand and stone. The rows of overlapping steps formed separate tiers, and dozens of men and women crossed between them as they went about their duties. Carved out of the hard brickwork in the center of the keep, the open-topped hall had once played host to violent games that would see its tiered levels overflow with bloodthirsty spectators. Thousands had flocked to the arena, eager to revel in the greatest carnival of violence the city had to offer. The blood sports had been banned during King Cedric's rule, though its new occupants were no less fearsome. A sea of fur and muscle, the mounts of the Hussars lay sprawled out across the amphitheatre. Larger than any man, and stronger than a destrier, the Black Bears formed the beating heart of the most feared regiment on the continent. Bellis clambered over the iron-rung fencing that surrounded the pit and lumbered toward the closest bear. Standing at over 15 hands at the shoulder, the Akashan was still smaller than the equestrian chargers favoured by the knightly chapters. But what it lacked in height, it more than made up for in size, and Bellis was nearly knocked over as the bear reared up on its hind legs to greet him. Duke was one of the largest in the pad, but at 20 years he had not yet reached his prime. Unlike their smaller cousins in the south, the black bears never stopped growing. The largest reported Akashan had been almost 20 hands at the shoulder, and had killed off an entire pack of hunting dogs before disappearing into the Basilisk Mountains. The breed originated in Akasha, and had been imported into Greater Varin by the hundreds before being released back into the wild, where they were butchered by wealthy thrill-seekers who purchased the rights to hunt them. Such experiences were costly, and more than one nobleman perished in the jaws of a black bear during the days of the Umbros hunts, so named after the aristocrat who first introduced the bears. Despite the risk, it was not long before the wealthy families grew bored with such pursuits. The hunts were forgotten as their attention turned to the latest thrill, and what remained of the bears were locked away, or else left to rampage through the strange wilderness they found themselves in. Many had been killed off during that time, or left to perish in their gilded cages. It was not until the first black bears appeared in Kunsk that they found a home. Pushed further north by ambitious trappers, the bears encountered the hardy folk that inhabited the winter territories. But unlike those that had hounded them in the south, the Kunskans did not fear the bears, and rather saw in them an opportunity. It wasn't long before the more intrepid locals began domesticating the bears and using them in the mines and fields. Their thick pelts and layers of fat meant they were well suited to the bitter conditions, and the Akashans thrived. Over the years, the bears became as much a part of Kunskan culture as the people themselves. Yarrow's own household had been privileged enough to be allowed to worship, and like those of many other families, their faith had been shaped by the appearance of the bears. Depictions of their god Urin had slowly transformed with their beliefs, and he had become something more akin to beast than man. A wall of noise met Yarrow as he climbed over the wall to greet his own mount. The amphitheatre had been designed with atmosphere in mind, and the clamour of bears echoed across its walls, whines and grunts, bellows and growls, all coalescing into a symphony of bestial sounds. Sumera rested beneath a wooden awning in the centre of the pit, but propped her head up at the sight of her rider. She grumbled warmly at his approach, and slowly got up from the ground, shaking off the dirt from her pelt. Yarrow ran a hand through her thick coat and smiled as she nuzzled her head against his neck. He could feel her muscles slowly coiling beneath his fingers as she pressed her shoulders against him, before she nudged his arm with more purpose. He retrieved a piece of dried meat from his pocket and dangled it before Sumera, who sniffed at it cautiously before gently taking it between her teeth. Yarrow hissed through his nose at the dribble that ran down his fingers, but his smile remained. "She grows bigger by the day," came a voice from beside him. "Scars." Yarrow greeted the old law-weaver with a nod, wiping the saliva on his breeches before turning to him. Skars Ignatsson was a giant of a man. Taller by a head than most of the Hussars, he towered over even Bellis, which only made Yarrow seem more diminutive in his presence. Above a wispy grey beard, Skars's face was a riddled mess of oath marks and scars. Runic symbols, tattooed with black ink and blood, covered all but the skin around his eyes, marking him out as one of Urin's chosen. Time had done little to diminish the size of the Lawweaver, and his crooked frame still bulged with muscles. A monster on the field of battle, gifted with the Red Rage, Skars had once been destined for greatness. But tragedy had struck, and the former lieutenant had been left a cripple, his back a blown-out mess of ruptured muscle and broken bone. Yarrow pitied him. It was only by some miracle that his life was saved at all, but he would never ride again. The Lawweaver groaned as he squatted down in the dirt beside Sumera, the chains of fate rolling around his neck. "I've heard the news." He raised a hand, gold bangles on his long arm rattling as he flourished it. "The men are not happy." Yarrow frowned. "It is not the task I would have chosen for them." "Chosen?" Skars snorted. "No, there was never to be a choice in this. Whether by your will or the will of another, the path was set." "Is that what the runes say?" "They say what they always say," said Skars, his jaws clenched and his eyes fixed on Yarrow. "The way ahead is clouded." "Wonderful," muttered Yarrow at the sky. He lacked the patience for rune reading, and the skill. The will of Urin had always been beyond his grasp, even as a prospect, but Scar's vague auguries had begun to frustrate him. What was the point of studying the runes if they could not be interpreted? The Lawmaster licked his lips and clutched the chain about his neck, sensing Yarrow's annoyance. Since Vorgar, the threads of fate have told me little. He paused, narrowing his eyes. It is as if a shadow hangs over us. I can only see what it wants me to see. Is there nothing you can tell me? Scars looked down into his hands, turning them over as he considered the question. He waited for a moment, mapping out the scars on his palms. I see bits and pieces, he said, looking up at Yarrow. But the pieces do not fit, and if they do, it is in a way I cannot understand. It is as if two different fates are vying for my attention. Nothing is certain anymore. Humor me, said Yarrow, crouching down beside the Lawweaver. Bits and pieces were better than nothing, after all. Scars nodded and stuck a hand into his robes, retrieving a small leather pouch from his pockets. It is always the same. He untied the loose knot of string and shook the bag. Urin has grown miserly with his offerings of late. Perhaps this time will be different. The runestones rattled within, bouncing off one another before the Lawweaver emptied them into his hand. Yarrow shrugged. He had grown to expect little from his god, and in that, at least, he had not been disappointed. Scars cleared a patch of dirt before him, smoothing out the red sand of the pit as he rolled the runestones in his hand. He muttered beneath his breath as he dragged a gnarled finger around the clearing, forming a circle in the dirt. Yarrow watched him closely. The ceremony fascinated him, though his understanding of the necessary rites and observances was limited. The circle is to bind the threads of fate. He'd been taught that as a prospect. The Fate Weaver ceased his muttering and cupped a hand around his mouth before blowing softly into the sand. The wind is to call upon Urin. He could remember his old Fate Master's voice as he led the prospects through the ritual, and the shake of his head when he saw Yarrow's own pitiful attempts. Scars spat into the sand. The spit is to seal the bargain. The old warrior pressed an index finger into the phlegm and spread it across the sand, careful not to touch the thin inroads of the circle's walls. He wiped the muddied finger against his knuckles and held the stones out above the sphere. With a nod to Yarrow, he dropped them into the sand. Always the same, he repeated, pushing aside the stones that had fallen outside the circle. Yarrow leant forward on his haunches and stared at the circle. The black stones were pebbles, really. They lay about the sand, seemingly at random, and told of a future only the Lawweaver could divine. Here, the fires of war. Scars pointed at a stone in the center of the circle. If Yarrow squinted, the red and white ink that covered it may have looked like fire. He wasn't sure. But this... Scars shook his head and picked up another of the stones. This means peace, not war. The runes contradict each other. They hide their secrets from me. He held it up to Yarrow before passing it to him. The rune looked much as the first one did, a mess of lines and carvings inscribed upon the surface of the stone. He shrugged and handed the rune back to Scars. You'd know better than I. Yarrow stared out across the pit as Scars grumbled to himself. Bellis was still wrestling with Duke, while Alina had disappeared, no doubt to visit her own mount, Wojciech, in the higher levels. A hierarchy had formed among the Akashians, and the older, larger bears inhabited the sand central to the pit. The rest, the juveniles and those that had not been able to maintain their position, occupied the concrete tiers that spiraled above the red sands. He could still remember when Sumera occupied the higher levels. She was smaller then, and less confident in her strength. But as he had progressed through the ranks of the Hussars, so had she. These are at least clear, said Scars, bringing Yarrow back to the present. You see how the river lies next to the Fang? The Lawweaver tilted his jaw toward the stones, his eyes still fixed on Yarrow. Almost like a snake. A pit of vipers. The Pauper Prince. Treachery, Yarrow nodded, remembering King Behan's words. Just so, Scars grunted. The king is right to be suspicious. The runes tell of many perils in his future, some that are beyond even my reading. His eyes narrowed slightly. How so? Scars shrugged, before gently running a hand over the remaining stones. These are but a fragment of the whole, and even they are only a piece of a piece. Perhaps my old master would have been able to divine more, but I can only read what I can see, and I see less with each passing day. Yarrow shook his head with a sigh and stared down at the dark red sand of the pit. They tell us nothing, then. He didn't know what else he had expected. The readings rarely offered any comfort, and more often than not, only raised further questions. His eyes narrowed further as he spotted another stone, half submerged in the center of the circle. And this, he said, brushing aside the sand. The stone was greyer than the others, worn down by time spent rubbing against the leather pouch.
Present in all my readings since Forgar.
Scars stroked absently at the old scars that lined his face.
An anomaly, perhaps, but one that I cannot account for.
Yarrow leaned toward the rune circle, clasping his hands together.
What does it signify?
But he already knew. He'd seen the red-eyed stone once before.
Death,
he said, before Scars could speak.
Yes, and no,
said Scars, thumbing the palm of his hand to ward off bad luck. Yarrow glared at him. Always something, but never a clear answer.
It is an ill omen.
Scars spat into the sand and stared at Yarrow.
Yes, it means death, but it can also mean change. A great change. Or a lesser one.
He grunted as he wiped clear the sand, smoothing out the rune circle before returning the stones to his pouch.
Only time will tell.